And so what we'd like to do now is just thank everyone for joining us so far. And we'll now jump into part 2 of the interview, which is actually discussing the article itself. And so for those of us, those of you who have the article or computer handy, you're welcome to pull that out. And what I'd like to do is just kind of go through some of the points you make in the article, Brynn, and talk about them. And there may be even points where we read from the article. Do you have the article handy in case we do read?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I may ask you at a point or two to kind of read, if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay. So first and foremost, what made you write this article? What was the trigger?
The new name Noah post about Savannah is really what I had been wanting to. Like, I had already written down some bullet points maybe 6 months ago about just not liking this phrase, and I hate this phrase, and sort of pondering about it, but I hadn't written anything. And then this post about Savannah came out. And
tell for those who are on Mars and have not heard at all what happened with Savannah, why don't you just talk about that? Give a little background.
Okay, yeah, and I'm sure you can Google it and it'll just come up. But a 12-year-old girl went to give her testimony in church, and she had decided, she'd prayed and thought about it, and she felt like she was accepted by God even though she was gay. And so she had written down her testimony, and she went to go give her testimony. And I think after 2 or 3 times of talking about being accepted as being gay, the stake leader, I can't remember who it was, had asked her if she could please sit down. So she was sort of silenced in doing that. And somebody in the audience was recording it. And I know there's been some talk about maybe this was staged. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't look staged to me, but whether it is or not, I think it's believable. And so the issue was people were commenting on this, and I don't read the comments usually, but Jared refused to let it go. So he came out and read these comments to me while I was like working in the yard, and I just got really angry, and I stopped working in the yard, and I came in and I typed this up. So
what about the comments made you upset?
Oh, there was one main discussion going back and forth where this gal was saying that basically, why don't you ever see anybody ranting and raving against the Catholic Church or Muslim? I mean, I don't think she said Muslims because that one's so like obvious, but she said, I think it's just telling that this means that the church is true. And I have thought that before as a kid. I remember going to conference and seeing people, ranting and raving and feeling in my little small world like, oh my gosh, why do they care so much about this church? It's clearly true. Like, why else would they be doing this? And I was just so sick of that sentiment, and I was sick to my stomach that I'd felt that way before. So I had to go write about it.
So basically, she was arguing that if a church receives opposition, then it must be true.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, because of the amount of opposition that it receives, and because it's the only one that receives it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you got really upset and you wrote it. And the first thing you do in the article is you talk about how the believer views the non-believer, and you try and put yourself in their shoes. Why don't you go ahead and read just that first paragraph of the article?
Okay, so it says, I've been mulling over this idea for a while, this idea of people leaving the church or Mormonism but being unable to leave it alone. Do you have someone in your life like this? What does it tell you about the gospel to know that they can't leave Mormonism alone? Does it strengthen your beliefs as you literally witness the adversary work his hardest against that which is clearly true? Is it not just another testimony to your beliefs? Do you see that the Spirit has left them and that now they are unhappy? Do you watch them feeling angry and sad and feel bad for them, wishing they could just see the error of their ways like the prodigal son return to your loving arms? Do you see the literal unfolding of divine consequence as you know that wickedness never was happiness?
So the audience of this article is who? Who are you targeting it towards? I mean, it's obvious, but.
Well, let me clarify first that a lot of times when I write a blog, I kind of just write. I mean, all of my things are just, it started out almost like a personal journal, but just online. So I didn't come out and think like, here's who I want to affect with this particular piece. But naturally, I have people on believing and non-believing sides who I care about. And so I'm always thinking about those people. So I'm sure I was wanting to to sort of reach out to my believing circle.
So it's meant for believers. And that's tricky, because are they even going to want to read an article that challenges their viewpoint? Did you think about that?
I did. I had some angrier language in here that I ended up editing out. Like, I think I had used the word patronizing at some point, and I was like, no, I mean, they don't think they're patronizing, so I'm going to take that out. And now anybody who's believing that's watching is like, oh, that's how she really feels. I'm not reading this.
So the target is believers. And was it your hope that believers would actually read this article and really give it a fair shot? Was that your hope?
I think so. Let me kind of look at it and, like I said, I kind of just write, but so whatever I'm feeling is what ends up coming out. I wanted believers and non-believers to read it. I wanted believers to feel comfortable reading it. I tend to write a lot in that way. Like I tend to not cite to anything not, really anti-Mormon. I tend to not say anything too inflammatory, because I do want people to feel comfortable reading it. I think most people are only going to read something that's uncomfortable to a small degree. Yeah. And so if you make it uncomfortable to a large degree, no one's going to want to hear that every time.
Yeah. And it's just so tricky, because so many Orthodox religious people, or Mormons particularly, are oriented towards really only seeing the only credible authority as a church leader, or the scriptures. And so they're going to be predisposed to not want to listen or take this seriously. And that's got to be hard. So, it makes sense. You're basically just writing what you feel and hoping there's an audience out there. I'm curious if there's any believers who are listening to this podcast and who have read Brynn's article. I would love to hear comments and questions for them. I'll give them preference, because I think it's going to be rare, the believer that's actually willing to read this with an open heart. And that's part of the problem, isn't it?
I think so. I think the church leaves room for people to do this kind of thing. I mean, treating people a certain way, and up to a point. And so I hoped that people could read it without it having to be like is this doctrinal or not doctrinal, but rather, this is more about how we treat people on an everyday basis.
Yeah. So an open invitation to believers out there to comment or ask questions. We would love to include you guys in the discussion, and to give you kudos for being willing to step outside what's correlated to consider other things. All right. So you talk about catchphrases, that talk about the catchphrase, they can leave the church, but they can't leave it alone, and what catchphrases do, in your opinion.
I mean, what I wrote there is what I think, like it's a shortcut to some, thing that you've thought out before. So you have some train of thought, some analytical reasoning or emotional reasoning, and you say it in some succinct way. And that's exactly what they can leave the church, but they can't leave it alone is. It's not saying what it says on the surface. What it's saying is it proves something. It shows something that they cannot leave it alone. And that something is that I think for a lot of people, that something is that it's true.
Yeah, for me, what it also does is it allows people who've left the church to be kind of dismissed. If you can come up with the cute catchphrase that maybe sounds a little bit witty and authoritative, then you don't have to actually consider their concerns and view them as human. You can just sort of go, oh, well, they leave the church, but they can't leave it alone. So now I'm going to just dismiss them and not really listen, right?
Yeah. I think for some people, that's what it is. It's not only a thought shortcut to, it's proof that it's true, but it's a thought shortcut to they are antagonistic, and I don't need to be around antagonistic people. So done.
And there's also this sort of assumption that if they leave the church, but they can't leave it alone, that they can't get over it. They're offended. They're just kind of weak and complaining. And we don't want to mess around with those types of people. There's also a brilliance to the phrase, because its attempt is to silence people, right? What would you,
I think so.
Can you see, and of course we're just brainstorming here, but can you see how basically shaming people who speak up against the harm the church does, how that works in the church's favor, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, if you're thinking of it as super contrived, which I don't always think of it as super
No, I
contrived,
don't think it is. No.
But if it were, yeah.
The effect of it is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the effect, whether it's planned or not, is definitely to do that. The effect is it distances people. I think a person who speaks up about leaving the church or conflicts with the church is not just a non-believer. At that point, they have changed to be more like Nehor, or more, they are the Antichrist now. They're not just the person who's misled, they're the person who is misleading. And that's a whole different ballpark for a believing Mormon. It's something that you are allowed to stay away from, that you are allowed to shun.
Yeah. And so, and just more importantly, I think the church knows that information. I mean, why else would they have hid or changed the history for so long? Why would they have spun a historical narrative that was incomplete and sometimes completely wrong? The leaders have to know on some level that information is powerful, that information is toxic. It's like a virus. And as we've seen the effects of Mormon Stories podcast, of other podcasts, of CES Letter, of Mormon Think, of the church's own essays, once information gets shared, it spreads like a virus and other people get infected, just like it happened with you with the issue of polygamy. And so it makes sense that to defend against that dangerous information, the church would want to create some catchphrase, whether they do this intentionally or not. It would benefit them to create a catchphrase so that anyone who is vocal could be dismissed, out of hand, and devalued and demeaned in a way to where you wouldn't want to give them thoughtful consideration. Doesn't the catchphrase kind of do that a little bit?
I feel like it does. I mean, It did with when I was on the other side of it. That's what it did to me. Like, I'm not going to give these naysayers any time because they're just running around, yelling and arguing about stuff that I don't need to know about.
Right.
I mean, I've heard that in a testimony meeting in our ward. Someone stood up and she said, I posted something on Facebook and somebody commented to me and said, well, have you ever read this? And I didn't go read it because I didn't need to. I didn't need to know what it said because I knew what it was sort of, getting at, which was anti-Mormon or whatever. And I didn't need to read that.
Yeah.
It's common to hear that.
Totally. Okay. So you go on, the one of the main sections, kind of the first sections you write to try and create empathy for those who speak up after they've lost their faith, is the section that says they didn't leave Mormonism until it left them alone and with absolutely no direction. Talk about what happens when somebody leaves Mormonism and what you mean by it left them. What do you mean Mormonism left them alone?
I mean, mostly this is going to be from my personal experience because I've talked to a lot of people, but I'm never going to have the depth with them that I have with myself, right? So this is about like everything I thought was wrapped up in Mormonism. When you find out that it's not what it said it was. I mean, I didn't do that. I didn't decide that it wasn't what it was. It just wasn't. And so it's its fault, not mine. And now I have, I didn't have anything. I didn't have anything to go off of anymore. So that's what I mean. I mean, all I did was read and study and pray and think. And that's what humans do. So it's not my fault that this left. It left me.
But you're also, when you talk about the church leaving them alone and with no direction, you're using that as a way to explain why people need to be vocal. Did you feel like you were without direction? And what is your experience with people who leave and feel that sense of directionlessness?
I mean, they need other people to talk to. I think that's what that is. It's like when you're left alone, you can't go to the normal community that you would normally go to for help. So where do you go? And especially people whose spouse is on a completely different page. That's supposed to be their confidant. So now what do they do? Well, I mean, they need to speak up because as soon as one person speaks up, everybody else says, oh my gosh, that resonated with me. And I'm so glad you said it because now I know I'm not alone. Now I know there's someone else I can talk to get ideas, examples. What do you do on Sundays? What do you do, when you have a problem? Where do you go to think it through? And then you have answers, whereas you didn't have them before.
Yeah. And it's so complicated because Mormonism is such, as most high demand religions, Jehovah's Witness, Scientology, Orthodox Judaism, evangelical Christianity, it's such a comprehensive mindset and worldview. Plus, as you mentioned in the article, you're only encouraged as an Orthodox religious believer to communicate and stick with other Orthodox religious believers who share your views. So not only is it catastrophic to have that worldview unravel, but all your friends and family are usually part of that. And so when you experience the distress of having your worldview unravel, you, like you mentioned in the article, you're angry, you're sad, you're lost, and you need someone to talk to. Well, all of the people that you would have normally relied on to be able to talk to are part of the system. And so it leaves you literally alone with your whole world kind of falling apart. Is that what you were getting at?
It is, yeah. One thing I would clarify, you say they're only encouraged to talk to each other. I think that's on paper not true. I think it ends up being true. I think we're actually encouraged, to try to go out and be every member a missionary. I just think we're not really great at that most of the time.
Yeah. I don't mean that we're taught don't talk to non-Mormons. That's not what I meant to say. But definitely, you're so busy in church with all the activities. You're socializing with the people. And I think we're taught that, I think that it's reinforcing as a believer to be around other people that believe. I just think that's something that we all do naturally. Post-Mormons tend to hang around each other. And so that's natural, I think. But also nobody wants to be around people who are going to threaten or challenge their worldview, right? And so you're right. The church definitely encourages relationships outside of Mormonism to the extent that it can hopefully lead to missionary efforts. But I think by and large, most Mormons, especially in heavily populated Mormon areas, their main friendships and relationships are other active believing Mormons. Isn't that fair to say?
I think it's absolutely fair to say. I think that it's scary for them to be around things that happen. Well, maybe not for everybody, but for someone that was real Orthodox like me, it's nerve-wracking to be around a group of people who talk in very colorful ways, or do things that you can't do or disagree with. And so it's very, very difficult, and not a lot of people do it. I remember we made friends with a neighbor who was inactive once, and they were basically saying nobody else has ever talked to us ever. And the lady had considered never wearing tank tops because she didn't want anyone to know she wasn't Mormon, and they had just moved to Utah like a year or two before that. So it's rare.
Yeah. Chris writes, when something is part of your core identity, it doesn't leave you overnight. You see this when anyone believes any type of belief system. John Larson's response to this catchphrase had something to the effect of, quote, what kind of psychopath could leave the entire worldview overnight and be fine with it? And I would add, and not talk about it. Yeah, you would actually be crazy and unhealthy and probably diagnosable if you lived 20 or 30 years under this, or 40 years under this incredibly strong and comprehensive worldview. And then all of a sudden you just, I'm moving on. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. That would actually be pathological. That's a great point from Chris. Mary writes, one reason leaving has been amazing for me is that it allowed me to view others through fresh eyes. The world is so much brighter. That's a great point. Anne writes, when you have been raised and have made almost every major life decision and then leave, it is a huge sense of hurt, deceit, sadness. And Brynn, I think you were getting at this in the article. It's very normal to mull over in your head how, for however long it takes to reconcile the amount of time, effort, and emotions that goes into transitioning out. So, quote, can't leave it alone, end quote, is more about emotional distance and healing than obsession over justifying a bad decision. And I will add, Anne and Brynn, that what I've discovered about Mormon Stories podcast, because we're over 750 episodes in, and a lot of the stories end up sounding very similar. But when you when you start doubting or even disbelieving a really rigidly orthodox religious believing system, oftentimes you doubt yourself. And you know, am I crazy? Could I be wrong? The stakes are so high. What if I am wrong? And so talking about it is the way that you process it. We are creatures of language. And so, yes, we must talk about it. And we must talk about it with non-believers, with non-Mormons, and with believers, because even a year, 2 or 5 into a faith crisis, many of us are still hardwired to think we're sinning, that we're wrong, even if the evidence is obvious and clear. And so talking about it is just the way that we process it, and in many ways try and decide that we're not crazy, right? That we're not evil and bad and crazy. Yeah. And I think that's really important. Any thoughts on that?
For sure. I mean, I quantified my experiences sort of scientifically. I remember making a journal, and I had different lists of, here are the things that have happened to me that make me believe. Here are the things that made me not believe. And then I started actually writing down the times. I have a different post about this, but the times when I tried to find a spiritual answer and got one versus the times when I tried to find a spiritual answer and didn't. And I was like looking at these, comparing, being like, oh, I thought I was getting answers, 80, 90% of the time. Really, it's like 10% of the time. I just had all these lists so that I could, look at it on paper and say to myself, like, is what I think is true actually true from my experience? And it wasn't actually initially. So definitely we have to write, we have to talk, we have to, work through it.
Absolutely. The last thing I'll say is there's, it's probably worth mentioning, by the way, that there's an actual temple recommend question that says something to the effect of, do you associate with people, who have thoughts or beliefs or actions that are in counter to the church? And even if that question is really engineered towards polygamists or apostates or whatever the case might be, it's basically priming you to think, well, I should stay away from anything that would ever cause me to doubt or question. And I think that's going to naturally cause people to stay away from people who hold opposing worldviews. So I think even the temple recommend question sort of prejudices people in this way.
Yeah, it's a very broad question. If it was meant to be real finite, I mean, I think there was a more finite way of saying it, but it's, if I remember right, it's very broad, groups or individuals who are antagonistic to church.
Yeah. Okay. So having talked about some sexual assault in your background, it's really interesting that you bring up domestic violence relationships as a way to sort of compare or analogize to the experience of someone losing their faith. Talk about why you chose that comparison.
So that's less of a personal example. I, in law school, kind of focused on domestic violence prevention. So that was more sort of educational, but I've, in my job before, did a lot of domestic violence prosecution. I worked with a lot of those people. And most of the time, it's a cycle and they're stuck in it and they rely on this person. So, whoever's being abused is in this situation where a lot of times their money comes from this person, their love and support comes from this person, their children are tied to this person, their home, a lot of times they're isolated, so they might not live near other family members. A lot of times they've gotten bad habits like drinking or whatever, which, if I'm using a metaphor, would be like judgment or distancing yourself from other people, and they're stuck there. And so then when they finally decide, or they get brave enough to leave, everything comes crashing down and they don't have support anymore because all of their family's mad at them for drinking or whatever they're doing, and they don't live somewhere, and their kids they're stuck in a custody battle. It's really similar, I feel like, because, and I said it's harsh, and I think it is maybe kind of a harsh comparison, but there are so many things that are easy to compare. So your community's tied up there. A lot of times your children are tied up there. There are very few things that I find more heartbreaking than hearing a person's story about how their kid feels like they're more righteous than their parent and is trying hard to get their parent back. I just think it's just flopped, and it's really sad. So that's where that comparison came from. I passionate about that in my work life, and I just saw a lot of parallels. Hold on a second, I lost your sound.
No, sorry, I sometimes cough, and so I mute.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I muted myself. And what was really powerful to me about that connection is that, it's always tricky because so many sexual assault cases come down to he said, she said, or she said, he said, or something to that effect. And it can get really complicated, especially when it involves someone you love on either side. And what you're saying is regardless of whatever the facts are, those things don't matter so much as if you're really trying to do good, then what you care about is what the person feels happened. Because that should matter regardless of the facts. Isn't that kind of a main point you were making?
It is. I think I'm being slightly manipulative there because obviously I also believe my position is right. So I'm doing my best to get somebody to listen to it enough that they can finally learn that it's right. But I think everybody does that. I think everybody just, they want to be heard. But at the core, at the beginning of that, whether you think you're right or wrong, how somebody feels matters. And it matters a lot more than I think we give it credit for sometimes in our society.
Yeah. So if someone feels they've been lied to or betrayed, that deserves love and understanding. And you'd think that'd be very consistent with the sensibilities that Christ tried to put forth of love and empathy and understanding and compassion, go the extra mile, that sort of thing. It seems like that would resonate with an Orthodox Christian or Mormon to just say, whatever, they're in pain and I'm going to listen to them and love them. And unfortunately, it's often too triggering for them to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of people suffer from too little self-analysis. And so they feel some feeling when they talk to their loved one, and it's hard. And rather than asking themselves why it is hard, they use a catchphrase or they use something to distance themselves from it. So they get away from the hard thing instead of saying like, oh, am I being triggered because I have some doubts, or am I being triggered because I'm so scared of not being with my loved one for eternity and it's hard to face that. And so they need to face that. They need to analyze it, figure out what the issue is, and then I think work through the conversation. Because when you find a little catchphrase or something that makes you feel good about it, you're just digging you're digging your own grave. Like you're distancing yourself from the person you love when it's that person's love that's causing you to be fearful in the first place, losing that person's love or losing that relationship.
Yeah. You go on to write about betrayal and how these, people often feel betrayed. You talk about promises that weren't fulfilled, that in many cases they were lied to. There were hypocrites, there are hypocritical things going on. You talk about this teeth gnashing guilt that people often suffer from, addictions that they develop when they're in an unhealthy religious framework and they're experiencing so much anxiety or depression or trauma. Often addictions do develop. And then you talk a lot about, other regrets that they'd have. If you don't mind, why don't you start from some of them wasted away their time and read that through the end where you write they are. Can you read that little section?
Yeah. So some of them wasted away their time, their energy, their educations, their relationships, trying to stand firm to something they now believe is utterly false. They shunned opportunities for good. It's better to go on a mission than to join the Peace Corps. They shunned people they should have loved. Don't date anyone you wouldn't marry. Don't jump into a pit to try to push someone else out. They increased their likelihood of poverty, putting off education for missions, placing no limit on the number of children they had, making life choices based on feelings rather than logic. They lost out on opportunities for personal education. Mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. They wasted their life feeling empty because of a faulty womb. God's commandment to multiply and replenish the earth remains in force. Some of them starved themselves or cut themselves, wondering all the while if they were legion and if God could and would cure them of their filth, all the while reading and praying and fasting more fervently than ever, trying to place themselves more in line with a book they now believe is nonsense. Some of them came close to suicide. Some of them are no longer with us. Whether it is or isn't, it feels like the ultimate betrayal. And so they are hurt. They are.
Yeah, that was really powerful to me. And I think a lot of people resonate with that. And I'll just say, back when the church was, back when Marlon Jensen was church historian, and when he realized that the internet was going to really damage the church, he saw the writing on the wall, and he reached out to us, believe it or not, and asked us to help him study people who left the church. And so we surveyed over 3,000, non-believing and post-Mormons to find out, what caused them to leave the church. And of course, there were all the typical reasons: polygamy, polyandry, blacks in the priesthood, Book of Mormon historicity, Book of Abraham, all that stuff. But, the truth is the world is full of people that believe crazy or difficult things. And a lot of people would say the polygamy, is surmountable. The questions about Book of Mormon historicity are surmountable. What so many people wrote in that study was that what was insurmountable was feeling like the church had betrayed them and lied to them and deceived them.
Exactly. You said two things. One is you got the typical responses. And I think for a lot of believers, those aren't the typical responses. They don't think that people are leaving over true like doctrinal issues. They think people are leaving over being offended or, not wanting to comply with the rules. So that's the one thing. But the other thing is, it's just, let me go back to this part here. I think that when people leave, they're misunderstood and they want to be understood, right? And it's the exact opposite of what's going on. They're being distanced, and nobody's going to be listening to what they want to explain about that. I think, for me, the issue wasn't polygamy. The issue was the dishonesty about the polygamy. And even when I talk to people about, well, let me tell you about polygamy, they stop there and they say, oh, she's been offended by something. There's something she doesn't want to obey. She doesn't want to share her husband with somebody. And I had worked through that a long time ago. I had reasoned to myself that people have multiple kids and they love all of their kids the same. And having more kids doesn't divide their love. So why couldn't the same be true of wives, right? I had reasoned this out. That's not the issue. The issue was the dishonesty and the betrayal about the polygamy.
Yeah. I'm going to stop and read a comment from our own Jerry Renshaw. She's wonderful. She writes, I'm listening while on my morning walk on a beautiful trail. That makes me happy to think that people are listening live while walking on a trail somewhere in Utah. And she had to stop and write this comment. So Jerry's hiking and she writes this comment on the side of the trail with her thumbs and her mobile device. She writes, I would self-describe as a thoughtful Mormon, as it has been my experience that the terms believing and non-believing can create an automatic divide. That's a good point. We talk about believing and non-believing a lot, and it's hard to use categories when we're describing people and not oversimplify. So thanks for helping us be thoughtful about that. Anyway, Jerry also writes, I appreciate this effort for greater understanding and bridge building here. When our son first came to us with his faith deconstruction, I can't even begin to describe the intense fear I experienced. Intense. Years later, I now fully understand the difficulties and reasons why many cannot stay. And not only is the fear gone from me, but I honor those choices. Greater understanding makes all the difference, in my opinion. And I think both sides can learn from these discussions. My hope is that we can begin to bridge the gap as we learn to better understand. And I think Jerry's right. The more that we can use language that helps make people feel comfortable to listen and to talk and to be open-minded and to discuss, the more we bridge the gap. And I'm assuming that was hopefully your goal, Brynn, and that's why you sometimes had to edit a little bit of your anger out of the essay. Is that true?
It is, because the fear, I think, is what drives people apart from their loved ones. And I think if they understood the people's intentions better, that fear would go away, because doctrinally, people who are good people who are, trying to find truth are going to be fine. I mean, arguably from a doctrinal standpoint, I grew up, Jared always says I grew up in a different Mormonism than other people, but that's what I grew up believing, that really accepting the gospel was about trying to be happy here and now because it had good life lessons, and that everybody would have a chance, and a real chance, not a, oh shoot, I didn't know enough then to accept it, like a real chance. And so I think if you can get rid of that fear and just feel comfortable with people who are making a different decision that you don't have to worry about there eternally, you can talk to them a lot more. Jared used to use this metaphor that I loved, and he talked about, being a kid, going outside and playing in the mud, and you walk inside, you get the carpet all dirty, and your mom's not home, and there's 7 different cleaners. There's Windex, and there's 409, and there's, you're trying different things on this carpet, and you got them all wrong. And your mom came home, and there was the stain, and she said, well, this was mom's special cleaner. You were supposed to use this one cleaner. But the kid tried, right? The kid was trying his best to get the stain off. He was trying everything he could think of. I don't see a parent, not a good loving parent, saying, okay, too bad, you're cast out of my house now because you didn't find mom's special cleaner. I think that holds up doctrinally. And I think when you believe that, if you can accept that, you can talk to all sorts of people with different ideas and be comfortable doing it.
And I love Jerry Lee's example of a still faithful, committed, thoughtful Mormon that's believing on some level, I'm guessing, who now not only loves and fully supports her son, but even can get in a place where they can feel secure in their belief and commitment to Mormonism, but they can also celebrate, not only fully understand, but even celebrate someone's decision, or at least honor it in a deep, respectful way, their decision to have to leave. And I think that's what we're all going for. I know at the Open Stories Foundation, we're not about tearing people away from the church, about hurting the church. We do want people to become aware of these difficult things. And then once there's awareness, then if people decide they want to stay or leave, that's not so important. What's important is that families don't get torn apart, relationships don't get torn apart, and that people are respected whether they stay or go. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, but the fear on the believing side and the anger and betrayal on the other side, those are really difficult emotions to bridge, right?
Very, very much so. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the main, I don't know if it's the main, but it's definitely a big problem with relationships. Like one person's real angry. And that's why I say, like, you got to look past that anger. If you're, a very thoughtful, still active, believing member, you got to look past that anger, the sarcasm you get. And you should do that in all aspects of any time a person's very, very hurt, because that's how humans respond, and they need a little bit of leeway to do that. And then on the other side, you got to calm yourself down and realize who you're talking to. Take a couple of steps back and be patient with how you talk.
Yeah. Chad writes, imagine being told after 40 years that your mom and dad aren't your mom and dad. You were kidnapped as a child. Your entire perspective of the world would change in an instant. That is, it's an example of feeling betrayed. Okay, so the next part of your essay talks about, you titled it, "It Stole and Broke Their Families." Now that's pretty hardcore language you're using there. Stealing a family is kind of language that you associate with like a cult, literally kidnapping your family. So why did you use such strong language saying it stole and broke families?
I think at this point in the article, I've made it pretty clear, I think, for the reader that I'm talking about how somebody feels. So I hope it's not, so much of a headline that it turns people away, or so harsh of a headline it turns people away, but this is how people feel. And the groups that I'm part of and the people that I talk to, like, what I hear over and over and over is, my wife's divorcing me and telling the kids that I'm a bad example. And it does. I don't know if it means to the church do this, but it does to lots of people. They break up their families, they can't make it work, and they're hostile about it. And they're sowing seeds of more and more misunderstanding to the next generation, or to parents, or to siblings, and it sucks.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like this always happens or this is church policy, but I certainly have heard many reports of a believing spouse being told by a bishop, this is going to, if this spouse won't honor their covenants, then that's grounds for finding a new spouse. And I've heard of even parents. This is even crazy. Let's just say there's a non-believing husband and a believing wife. I've heard of parents of the non-believing husband encouraging their daughter-in-law to leave their own son and find a new spouse because the son had lost their faith. And what type of system would cause a parent to encourage their daughter or son-in-law to leave their own child? It's a crazy mentality that really does break up families. And again, I have a very close friend who was faithful for more than 20 years, and recently he came out to his wife, and in an otherwise very healthy and happy on the surface relationship, her immediate response was, "I want a divorce." And so it happens. And you go on in your article to talk about different statements made by different general authorities that kind of reinforce that mindset. Can you talk about some of these statements that are often made in general conference and in the ensign?
Yeah, I don't, like I said, I don't think that they are directly saying any person who decides they don't believe in the church, so I'm going to call that a non-believer, is bad or evil or apostate. Certainly it infers that, and certainly it says it for those who speak up. Because, I mean, what other conclusion is there but to think that when you get told over and over again about Antichrist being among us? I think Carlos Acey, his talks about many of them are still among us, releasing new floods of lies and false information, and all they really want to do is break down your peace. I think he calls them faith killers, and he talks about using printed word and electronic media. And, that's back in, I think his is in the 1980s, but, we believe these are words from God. It's spoken in conference, and so it gets applied to today. And certainly electronic, word is huge right now. And so anybody that's spreading information is now in line with these antichrists and anti-Mormons and being associated with that. The same. I had a talk in there from Claudio Zivic. I can't remember if his was from conference or not, but yeah, it's about how to avoid personal apostasy. And the way to do that is not to fall in line with, these like 5 things that cause apostasy. And so, I mean, the implication is you shouldn't be around people who would make you do that. And those are the people that are apostates and talk about it. So we can't talk about it, or else we become in line with those people.
And it makes sense why the brethren are so concerned about people talking, because talking about it is what leads to empathy, which leads to reading. It's just like what happened with you, Brynn. If Jared hadn't have started questioning and talking to you about it, you might not have ever started reading and thinking and talking about it. So it makes logical sense why the continual effort to silence, whether it's intentional or not intentional, and to speak ill of or defame or encourage people to distance themselves from non-believers, because it really becomes viral. And so the only way to respond to a virus is to quarantine, at least in the minds. I would just say to those Mormon leaders, you can't escape the internet these days. You can't escape truth. I think what they should want to do is to create members with commitments to the church so strong that information doesn't affect that. And that's a difficult thing. And I think they're trying to do that with the essays and with the new changes to the curriculum. But that just seems like a much more sustainable way than to sort of try and demonize everybody and encourage everybody to distance themselves from those who have doubts or questions.
Or maybe allow it to be affected without being destroyed, like it is for people like Jerry Lee, who can talk and who can empathize without it destroying everything. And I think that's a much more comfortable place for us all to be in.
Yeah. So using terms like anti-Mormon or apostate or antichrist, all these warnings to not talk and to stay away. I think they're anti-family. The church likes to say that it is pro-family, family is the most important thing, and that it's all about family. But this is where things get really difficult. Oftentimes, high-demand religions and definitely Mormonism can actually be responsible for harming families, for causing stress in families, for dividing families, and ultimately for tearing families apart. George writes, I'm slowly being erased from my extended family's history. I'm becoming the forgotten, unknown uncle who, when once I was the star, because I was carrying on the family name and priesthood. And Brian writes, what's so funny is I'm experiencing all the same things because my wife is now a vegan, not being invited to the family's Father Day barbecue, not going when we had a late invite because my wife can stand to be around people like them. It's just ridiculous on both sides. So Brian makes the point that it's not just Mormons and believing Mormons. And I imagine that there's post-Mormons that judge and ostracize and alienate believers, and demean and criticize those who choose to believe, and who even exclude them and ridicule them. And I would say, from the Open Stories Foundation, both are bad. We need to have love and empathy and tolerance going both directions.
I agree. I don't think it has to destroy your position either. I think, a vegan can do their best to kind of stomach the idea that other people are not going to be treating the earth and the animals and anything, the way they want them to. They can go to this party. And on the other hand, the people there can say, hey, what could we make you to eat that would be appropriate for you? And you can keep your position and make it work. And I think what needs to be happening more is giving us the tools to work in that middle ground. We don't have those tools in Mormonism, or really in post-Mormonism, very much to bridge that gap.
Yeah. So I hear in your essay a strong plea to Mormon church leaders and to Orthodox believers to stop demonizing those who doubt as evil or bad, and even referring to them as under the influence of Satan, etc. You write that that's really extreme language, but that it's relevant, that it's pertainable, right?
It has to be, because I was a very deep thinking, believing Mormon, and I thought that. I mean, maybe I'm taking my own personal experience and projecting it on too many people, but I've heard other people think that, and I thought that, and I feel like I don't think that that's too out of line to say that.
Yeah. And then I think the point that you bring home in this section, that's most important, is if the church does end up coming between people and their families, if it does end up dividing families, either emotionally or leading to divorce, then of course people are going to want to talk about it, because their whole family now, not only have they lost their worldview, but now their whole family's been torn apart. Why don't you go and read the last paragraph in this section? It starts with, and if their family just got ruined.
If their family just got ruined by something that not only utterly misunderstands them, but that refuses to listen to them for fear that it will lead them astray, and that leaves them alone as the one out because it fears talking to them or doesn't know how to talk to them, or both, then is it really any wonder why they might want to talk about that, why they might not be able to just move on from that? I mean, if they seek to listen to be heard, maybe they can get their spouse back. Maybe they can get their family members to start calling and chatting with them again, to treat them normally. Maybe they can help others feel loved when they too are questioning. Maybe they can help a sibling or a nephew or a friend or an old home teacher. Maybe they can clear up the misunderstanding. Maybe they can heal relationships. Maybe they can be seen once again as a good father or a good daughter or a good neighbor or just good.
Yeah. So many people just want to be understood. They want to be heard. They want to help others who might be new to the questions or struggling or uninformed. They want to help out people who are in need. They want to be understood. And all of those are the reasons why. And so you're right. And so they're going to talk. They're not going to leave it alone. when it affects the very fabric of their relationships, not to mention their worldview. Okay, so you go on to write about Savannah and her post, her testimony that was then silenced, and I want you to go ahead and read in the next section, and the section is called "It Continues to Affect Them." You write how once they leave, they cannot escape it, and this is, I've actually seen many articles over the years dealing with this topic of leaving the church and not being able to leave it alone. And basically what the argument post-Mormons often make is the church won't leave me alone. The church keeps calling. They keep sending out people to try and save us. They keep bringing cookies by. They keep trying to keep our kids in the church. They keep judging us. They exclude us from things. If those of you who checked out Jen Parkinson's interview from last week, many times non-believers get disinvited from family events when they used to be invited. And so it's not like you can just leave the church and then it's all unicorns and lollipops and jelly beans and rainbows. Oftentimes you're continually barraged by missionaries, by well-intended ward members, by family members that send you articles that you didn't want, or they subscribe to the ensign for you, and those ensigns arrive in your mailbox, and you're disinvited to things and marginalized and ostracized. Go ahead and read that paragraph that starts, "It surrounds their families."
It surrounds their families, their communities, often their neighborhoods. It checks in on them from time to time and invites them with ulterior motives to hang out. It writes them random, often anonymous warnings about how they're going to hell. It tells them they're ruining their children. It refuses to let their children play with its children, crosses them off of potential spouse lists. It prays for them to turn from their wickedness, and it tells them as much. It posts passive-aggressive memes knowing they'll see them. It calls them on Sunday and tells them what a wonderful time it had in church and how they're missing out on so much. It pans up and down when it sees them, eyeing their completely normal, but I guess it would say worldly, clothing choices. It feels a surge of righteousness at standing boldly and loudly, in print or spoken word, against how they act or even who they are. It misunderstands them. It fears them. It judges them. Call it righteous judgment, call it pity, call it caring, but spoken or silent, it is judgment. And it leaves them substantively alone, but practically bombarded by Mormonism.
Go ahead and read the next little section.
And so even those who have emotionally moved on and who have made new communities and relationships are prodded and poked and pushed and prompted and provoked. So they're going to talk. They're not going to leave it alone when it continues to refuse to do the same for them.
Yeah, I really love that. They are bombarded. They're substantively alone, but bombarded by Mormonism. So the church doesn't leave us alone. And so, of course, we're not going to go silent, or at least many of us won't. Mary, this is interesting. Mary writes, "I grew up in the Worldwide Church of God, which went from cult under Herbert Armstrong to evangelical Christianity. HWA took some doctrines from Mormonism. That is how I began researching the LDS Church. The missionaries visited me several times recently also. I found Mormon stories and I'm shocked at the similarities. I was disfellowshipped and am very shunned by my mom still, even though she doesn't even have a church to attend anymore. The control is still there from all the years of brainwashing." I had friends, Mary, growing up who were in the Worldwide Church of God. Mary, I'd love to have you on Mormon Stories podcast to tell your story. So please reach out to me, and we want to schedule you. Yeah, a lot of people think that if the church somehow were to be harmed or destroyed, that this would all end. But the truth is, we know from the movie Spotlight in the Catholic Church that you can have systemic child abuse worldwide, and the church still thrives. So this stuff isn't going away. And that's a really powerful story, that Mary's mom doesn't even have a church to attend, and she's still feeling the effects of having left that church. Larry writes, "They've followed me for 30 years. I even asked to be on the do not contact list, and they still keep coming. And everything else you said, magazine subscriptions, transcripts of Mormon talks, etc." Julie writes something that's really important, because oftentimes, families aren't overtly mean or rude. But Julie writes, it's often the emotional distancing in my family that still kills me since leaving the church years ago. I'm not sure it's anyone's fault. I left the club, and in the club is where my family bonds. And that's just true. So many Mormons, all they talk about is Mormonism. And they talk about their callings, they talk about the mission, they talk about the latest thing at church or general conference. And so there's this question of what are we going to talk about now? Because maybe I love science now. Maybe I love, a TV show or a really great movie, or maybe I'm into, new things that I'm exploring. But do my Mormon family and friends even want to talk about that? Does that connect with you in any way, Brynn?
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe one of the things that's helped me be able to bridge some of that is when I first started my job out here in Colorado, I had a couple of colleagues who were just really interested, not in Mormonism, but in talking to me about Mormonism. And so I had all these conversations with my good friends, Erin Hogan. I talked to her, for hours about what I believed and what she believed. And it was fascinating. And at the time I was still traditional believing, and it didn't change my beliefs. And I didn't feel like I needed to change hers. I didn't feel like I needed to save her. And it was just very enjoyable. So I thought, well, here's this thing. Why can't we do this thing all the time in our families?
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're nearing the end of the article. In the article, you end by with the section, Mormonism colored me. What were you trying to say? Go, if you don't mind, why don't you just read how you close the article?
Sure. Mormonism colored me. It is part of who I am. It is woven throughout all my childhood memories. It is the entire foundation of my college years. It was the guiding force for my first post-grad school job, for my move to Colorado, for my choice to have children. Luckily, I think that the logical parts of me were secretly at play in these decisions as well. Whether I accept its teachings or not now, how profoundly ridiculous it would be to think that I would just never talk about it again. Why on earth would I leave it and then leave it alone? This is the sentiment of 1,000 voices who are all trained to sing under the guidance of a Sunday hymn. So you can take that sentiment and apply meaning to it if you want. This must mean that Satan has it out for the church, and Satan must have it out for the church because it's true. And then you can give that sentiment a little catchphrase. People can leave the church, but they can't leave the church alone. And you can continue to feel biased about that position, or you can listen. I think you're muted again.
Yeah, I love that. Or you can listen. I loved the way you ended. And that's the trick, is that so many post-Mormons want, questioning Mormons, liberal Mormons, they just want to be listened to. And yet I wrote in the very beginning of the article, is this even possible? Is it possible, Brynn, to have a believing Orthodox mindset and to listen? Because so much of a Mormon testimony is based on emotion. It's based on the youth conference experience. It's based on love for family. It's based on love for community. It's based on a sense of security for the things that the church offers you, like a sense of identity, answers to questions about death, what the purpose of life is. All of those things inform why someone oftentimes believes, and they're very emotional. And so listening means you open yourself up, and literally you open your mind up to hearing things that could threaten and challenge your worldview. And so I think that's why listening is such a simple request, Brynn. And I think it's almost unreasonable to ask for someone who cherishes their religious beliefs. What do you think about that?
I think it has to be possible, because it was for me. I listened to Jared. I listened to him little by little. I think that everything needs to be, for a lot of people, slow. And I think everybody is emotional, whether you think you are or not. You can conclude logically one way or the other on any given argument based on how you feel about it emotionally. And one of the ways that's applicable is Mormon doctrine is broad and vast, and it has so many opportunities for you to validate listening. I validated listening to Jared through 2 Corinthians. I validate listening to other people's experiences because I'm supposed to be a member missionary. How do I be a member missionary if I can't be out in the world? You can take what you have, and if you feel emotionally driven to do so, you can logic your way there. Unfortunately, that's how logic works. I think too often we think it's separate from emotion, and it's not. So if you can change your emotion to be, you love this person and you want to still have a relationship with these, a community or a person or someone in your family, then you get yourself there through your own doctrine. And maybe you take it slowly, but you still go.
Absolutely. And that's why I love your case as an example of where this is possible. But you have to admit it's really hard and it's really scary, right? And look how you end up, Brynn. Isn't it fair to say you're the cautionary tale of what happens when you listen?
Maybe, but I mean, what about Jerry, who's commented today? She was listening to her son. She's not afraid anymore, and she's where she is, and she's strong, and she's glad to be there, and her son's where he is.
Yeah, and I would agree. My parents on both sides are still believers, and they've listened to me. My sister has listened to me, and she's still very much a believer. And it's very much possible. So I think people should have hope. I was just trying to touch on the part that it really isn't just a simple ask. It is a scary, terrifying ask. And there are many people that just don't want to go there, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I had a simple conversation, maybe 10 minutes long with Jared, and then I spend the night bawling and listening to Mumford Sons on repeat,
Right.
But then you wait a week and then you have another 10-minute conversation, and then you understand where that person's coming from and how they feel. And you don't have to accept what they say, and you can if you want. I did, because that's what felt honest to me.
Right. I love it. Hector writes, and this is my good friend Hector, this was the first Father's Day that not a single one of my 5 true believing Mormon adult children contacted me to say Happy Father's Day. Hector writes, I left the church in January 2014 after 43 years. So love you, Hector. We're standing with you during a difficult time. We're so sorry that that's how your kids have responded. Holly writes, when your fundamental beliefs change, so do the fundamentals of all your relationships. Some can survive that change, some cannot. It is like grieving the death of a relationship that will never be the same. And that's true. Not only are non-believers and questioners grieving the death of their orthodoxy and their worldview, but believers are grieving the death of their visions of a celestial family where no one's left behind and there's no empty chairs and everybody's together up in the afterlife. And it's difficult and a matter of grieving for both sides. And I appreciate Holly for reminding us of that. Kathy writes, asking us to be a little bit more balanced. She writes, how is not inviting believers to events being bombarded? If you have immediate family who hasn't left the church, that's part of their life still. What is the answer? Do you want to be invited or do you not want to be invited? I think each individual would have a different preference. And I think there are levels of leaving the church just as levels of conversion. There's no handbook to understand each individual's journey. Throw believing families a bone here. Their intent is not malicious. What would you say to Kathy? That's a good point.
When you were talking earlier about how much people get bombarded with it, I wanted to say a lot of that is valid. If you believe that the way to make people happy is to give them a doctrine, eternally happy, I don't think that you should be as faulted as we sometimes fault you for spreading that, for taking that to people, and you've been told you do this by visiting teaching and home teaching, and that's how you do it. So that's valid, and I think it needs to be valid. But we're not talking about necessarily the actions themselves always being the problem. They are for some people, but we're talking about the actions being a problem when you then say that I can't talk about the actions. We're saying we need to listen to how we feel about it, and everybody's experience is individual. So you need to ask the individual. When I was still believing and I was assigned to visiting teachers, I would first ask each person, Are you interested in being visit taught? Is this even something you want? And if so, like, are you okay with, how should we do this? Because the church has subscribed a way to do it, but I'm uncomfortable being told to be your friend. And yet I would like to get to know you, so yes or no, do you want this? Listen, you just need to ask and listen.
Yeah, I love it. I'm really grateful for Kathy's challenge of us and her highlighting the fact that it really is a paradox, because if you leave the church and everybody just sort of leaves you alone to give you space, then you're angry because people, you can be angry because people have sort of, ghosted you, or they're distanced from you, or you feel isolated. But then if they engage with you, sometimes you can feel bombarded. And so I appreciate Kathy highlighting that paradox. But Brynn, I think you give a really good response to Kathy, which is, well, why don't you just ask? What would you like? What would you not like? What would work for you? How can I be a support? And I think that goes both ways. I think non-believers can ask that of believers, and believers can ask that of non-believers. What are the boundaries that we can have in our relationship where we can both feel safe, where we can both feel supported, and we can both learn and listen and empathize with each other and carve out a new relationship where we both feel respected? That's reasonable, right?
I think people feel awkward sometimes being that practical about their relationships, and yet when you actually do it, it doesn't end up feeling as awkward as you think it's going to have that kind of a conversation. And it's not just about, how often should we talk to each other, how should we talk to each other, but what should we talk about? That's one of the issues I think people have. They don't get invited to the family barbecue, which why not? But then they do get asked to be home taught, which is all based on, doctrine and religion. So why is it that you can share the religion with me, but not yourself, not your personal life? That feels harsh for a lot of people who are not in the church.
Absolutely. I'll read a few more comments from our listeners. Melissa writes, it's almost like a death and everyone has to adapt to a new normal. Barb writes, I think communication is the key, Kathy. I haven't told my family that I don't believe any longer, and so I'm not offended at all when they invite us. They are acting out of love. If at some point I come out to them, we will have to have those conversations. Paul writes, when a church stops listening, how can it continue to respond to the needs of its members? Instead, we're advised to doubt our doubts, keep silent, and don't share your concerns and questions with others. Thanks, Paul, for sharing that. Patricia writes, great article, great podcast. Becca expresses love for Hector, who's going through a hard time. All right. And Jennifer writes, awesome podcast, y'all. Thank you. And I think she's posting the flag from Chile. It's either Chile or Texas, but either way, thanks, Jennifer, for the kind words. All right. So, Brynn, what's the response been to your article? Has it been silence? Has it been outpouring?
I mean, so far there's only a few comments, and people have just been kind, sharing their positions about, well, some people need to learn how to move on. And I think that those were valid points. I haven't had a lot of backlash, which I would expect, I think, in something that's being read this much. I'm really surprised at how much this resonated with people. I'm really glad that it did, but so far, no hate mail. I'll go check. Maybe I have new ones.
Does it say how many reads so far? How many views? And also, have any close family or friends reached out to you?
Yeah, so it has 16.2 thousand views.
That's great.
Yeah, and then I had a second cousin reach out to me and just sort of validate and say, thanks for sharing. I'm glad that you've been honest. And, he shared with me that he's honest in his decision to stay. And I believe that he's a very good, honest person. So that was very nice. And other than that, I mean, sometimes I receive some hate mail stuff. Like I've said, people saying I'm going to hell. Nobody's really said that this time.
Not yet. All right.
Not yet. Now they will, I'm sure.
Well, that's been great. Well, I just want to thank, Jennifer clarifies it's Texas, not Chile. We're glad that she is tuning in from Texas. Corinna writes, we are not only not invited, but not even told about baptisms, blessings, etc. Our kids especially feel ignored and are hurt at not being told about the events of their cousins' lives. it would be nice to at least know what is going on in family members' lives. And Cree and I can relate to that. We've been not invited to graduations and baptisms, and we wouldn't be disruptive. We would be supportive of people's baptisms and confirmations and priesthood ordinations. But at some point, many times those invitations stop coming. And that's sad when that happens. And there are family members who won't speak to me, who literally will leave the house when I come visit. And that's hard. But again, it's hard to hold it against anybody because everybody's just trying to cope in the way that they know how. And it's just a mess. It's just a mess, isn't it?
I think so.
All right, Brynn. So what final comments or suggestions would you have for our listeners? Any final insight you want to share?
Like you said, it's a mess, right? But life is a mess. And one of the things that I find most enthralling in life is finding an opportunity for transformation. And you don't find an opportunity for transformation unless you have a mess, because cleaning up something clean is not a transformation. And so, take your mess. Maybe it's not all up to you. And so maybe you can't fix it on your own because somebody else is unwilling. But find the friend or the cousin or the aunt or the whatever family member that is willing to be open to you, and start taking the steps on either side. Maybe you're not inviting them to the baptism because you think they'd be offended, but then call them up and say, hey, I know you're not out of the church. I don't know how you feel about the church, but we're having a baptism. Do you want to come? I mean, other churches do this all the time. Lots of non-Catholics attend Catholic christenings. We can do that. So find that person who you think is open and call them or text them or talk to them or ask them how they feel. And you'll see that transformation.
I love it. Are you hopeful? Are you hopeful that these bridges can be created, that someday there can be a point where faithful, Orthodox, believing Mormons can harmoniously live side by side in families and communities with post-Mormons and non-believing Mormons?
Not categorically, but I don't think that anything changes categorically. The idea is to affect certain people that are willing and open to it.
But maybe things can get better?
I think so. I was surprised joining some communities of post-Mormons to find out how much was so overt. I didn't realize how many people would have a mother literally come to them and say, you're evil or you're bad. And so it's much more insurmountable than I thought initially. However, I also have my mother and my father who are very, they're a little bit, they're a little silent, so sometimes you feel judged by them, but at the same time, they're very accepting and open in other ways. And so that gives me hope. My own story gives me hope. I think that it's possible, at least in some places, with some people.
I love it. Well, Brynne Thomas Gant, the article is entitled, They Can Leave the Church, but They Can't Leave the Church Alone. You can link to it. We'll put it on the show notes of the podcast when we put it up. We want to invite people to share the article. We want to invite people to comment on it. And Brynn, we just want to thank you for having the courage to write this article and for trying to be a part of the solution.
Thank you.
Also, thanks for coming on Mormon Stories for a second time. It's always great to have you, and we hope to have you back again.
Sure thing. Like I said, I'm not just an open book. I'm an open library. So you can ask me anytime. Anybody's welcome to ask me things. And I hope that this resonates and helps some relationships.
Thanks, Brynn. It's great to have you. And I'll just close by thanking all of our listeners. We had hundreds and hundreds of people join in to this episode, which was really great. We weren't sure how popular it would be this early in the morning, but we kind of found out about this over the weekend. And for Brynn's schedule, we needed to kind of make it early. So we want to thank everyone for tuning in. It says that 5.5 thousand people viewed it. 17.994 thousand people were reached. We know that that's going to extend to people listening asynchronously through the podcast. So we just want to thank everybody who tuned in, everyone who commented, everyone who made suggestions. Doing this live is often fun, and it really helps make it more engaging and interactive. So thanks to everyone who joins us for Facebook Live discussions. We also want to thank everyone who tunes in through the podcast or through YouTube. This conversation can continue. So please don't hesitate to go to mormonstories.org and make comments or questions there in the blog. Also, those of you on YouTube watching later, there can be conversations there as well. So please feel free to continue the conversation. We want to thank Amy Grubbs and Cody Layton, who are part of the OSF staff, along with the Open Stories Foundation board. The board and the staff keep everything alive. Those of you who donate to Mormon Stories or to the Open Stories Foundation, your donations go to the mission of the foundation and to allow us to have the staff we need to do things right, to run in an efficient and in a effective and in a transparent way, to do the marketing that we need to get this information out, to hold the events that we hold, to be able to not only support people in their deconstruction of their worldviews that aren't healthy, but also to construct new lives. So if you do not donate to Mormon Stories or the Open Stories Foundation and you find these programs valuable and you want to see them continue, please consider today a donation. $10 a month, $25 a month can really keep us alive. So please consider supporting us if you don't. Don't forget our other podcasts, the Thoughtful Faith podcast with Gina Colvin, Mormon Matters podcast with Dan Witherspoon, Mormon Mental Health podcast with Natasha Helfer Parker. And of course, as a part of Mormon Stories, my dear wife, Margie, joins me for Mormon Transitions themed podcasts where we help people in their transition. And this is one of those episodes. We did it so early that Margie couldn't join us, but she'll be joining us for our next episode as we continue our series on supporting people who are trying to stay faithful in the church as unorthodox or untraditional Mormons. So join us more for that as well. Again, we just want to thank everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate all the support. Check out mormonstories.org/events for the upcoming events in your area. And stay tuned for more incredible, transformative content from the Open Stories Foundation. All right, Brynn, thanks again. So great to have you. Please take care.
Thank you. You too.
And everybody else, take care. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again soon on Mormon Stories. See you, everybody.